Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I really agree with what Professor Heel was just saying. It was nice to catch the end of his conversation as well. I'm here to talk about what we do to tackle the net zero challenge and this critical issue of climate action. The world needs to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But those that can do more faster need to do so. And so for us, that meant committing to be net zero by 2030. And that requires a substantial investment. But that investment also enables us to work collaboratively with organizations around the world and to deploy the most advanced removal approaches that are really essential to meeting the Paris Accord. So today in this presentation, which I'll try to do fairly quickly because I want to leave time for questions if people have them, is to first highlight why action on climate is needed. I suspect that will be very straightforward and mostly broadly understood. Focus particularly on what business can do to move the needle toward a net zero future, and then discuss the bigger picture on what we need to do as a society to address climate change. So let me dig right in. This first chart is probably seen in various forms by many of you, but it's still a shocking chart to see. The atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is closing rapidly in on 1.5 to 2 degree levels. This is a 2,000-year-old chart. Most of you probably don't look at 2,000-year-old charts, but it's crystal clear about the dramatic change we've seen recently. To me, equally shocking is if I showed you an 800,000-year chart, it would look almost identical. So this is unprecedented in what we're seeing in the world right now. And without a drastic turnaround in global emissions, we're going to reach levels that are at this 1.5 to 2 degree level in the next couple decades. The second thing is that COVID-19 has triggered the largest emissions drop since World War II. Due to COVID, 2020 emissions are going to turn out to be about 6 to 8% less than 2019 levels. This is only a bit more than what the world would need to achieve annually for a 1.5 degree path. But of course, this is not the way we want to get there. The economic decline and the human suffering that went with COVID is the last path we want to take to try to move to a net zero future. But looking at it highlights the scale of the challenge ahead to reduce carbon in a more productive way for the world, in a less negatively impactful way. Our current trajectory is not trending in this direction. COVID has caused a small drop unrelated to structural changes, and hence we're quickly bouncing back already to where we were. So there's a real rebound risk for global emissions, and there's many reasons why the world may go back to or get at least near to historic emission levels even as we move beyond the crisis, including fossil fuel pricing, the carbon asset base, the lack of funding that governments may face to be able to move forward on their transitions. And to change this, we need to rethink how we produce and how we consume energy. What we do see is that companies are making increasingly ambitious commitments. In the absence of sufficient action by governments, more and more companies are committing to increasingly ambitious targets. In many cases, net zero even before 2050. And as I said, BCG's been among those. We've committed to being net zero by 2030 and climate positive beyond. We also see that investors are rewarding climate actions. CO2 emissions are increasingly viewed as a business risk by investors. Climate risk is financial risk, I think, is increasingly understood. And as a result, the lowest emitting companies in most industries traded a 10 to 15% premium versus the industry average, and the highest emitting ones trail it by a similar margin. This is the rationale given investors who will be the first to feel carbon risks materializing. And it just as a simple example, with an EU utility, when the energy transition started 10 years ago, conventional utilities only lost microscopic levels of market share to renewables year on year, but they lost 60 to 80% of market value within a few years versus the market. If we go to the next section, how do you get there? Companies have up to seven levers. It depends on what their specific industry is in order to get to net zero. The first is to increase the circular use of resources. Second is to increase efficiency. Third, to switch to renewable power. Fourth, to switch from fossil fuels to electric or renewable solutions. Fifth, to use low carbon hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels. Sixth, to pursue carbon capture, utilization and storage. And seven, offsetting, the conversation that you were just a part of. Most can get to or close to net zero with only the first four of those seven levers. For most companies, bringing down emissions is much cheaper than they think. In all emissions reduction programs BCG's run so far, even in energy intensive sectors, companies still had significant potential for CO2 reduction that was economic, between 25 to 40% of their total emissions curve, based on our project experience, mostly through efficiency and circularity, and even more that was available at comparatively low cost per ton of carbon costs, often getting to above 60% in some cases, mostly through renewable power. For many, even net zero is possible at no additional net costs, because measures with cost savings and measures with additional costs cancel each other out. Therefore, for many companies, moving to net zero is not predominantly a commercial challenge, but that by no means means it's not a big challenge that requires major changes in operations, processes, measurements, incentives, working with suppliers, and so forth. It's also important to note that not all companies can do it alone. This is very different for companies in the so-called hard to abate sectors, such as steel, cement, base chemicals, aviation, and shipping, where a full path to net zero requires unproven technology that is currently very expensive, whether that's low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture, renewable fuels, and therefore carries serious competitive risk. And companies in these sectors will need support, either through green markets brought about by customer commitments, or through stronger policy support, such as quotas for green steel or cement, through carbon border taxes to prevent leakage across border, through subsidies, through other means. Interestingly, these sectors only make up 4% of global GDP. So this would be possible if we wanted to, but it requires substantial government involvement in order to work the bridges between sectors that are really, really challenged and the rest of the economy in each country. If I go to page 9, or this page, many value chains can be decarbonized at low cost. For many companies, the largest share of their emissions footprint is not within the boundaries of their own operations, but it either happens in their supply chains or through the use of their products. Emissions throughout supply chains are extremely difficult to address. They're not under companies' direct control. Full transparency is difficult to achieve. Some require working directly with suppliers or addressing suppliers, even the further upstream parts of their supply chains. Taking an end-to-end supply chain view from raw materials to final end consumer products reveals that many value chains, food, construction, fashion, all of which are shown here, can be decarbonized at low cost. 40% of emissions within these end-to-end value chains can be abated at less cost, at a cost that's basically below 20 euro per ton of the equivalent carbon dioxide. Full value chain decarbonization can lead to only minor cost increases for end consumers. When looking down the value chain to the end consumers, the overall cost increase for green products is marginal if companies work together along the value chain. We've done a lot of work with the World Economic Forum on this that shows, for example, although carbon neutral steel might be 50 to 100% more expensive than today's steel, a car built with carbon neutral materials, including 100% carbon neutral steel, will only be about 2% more expensive. A similar logic applies in many other sectors, as you can see on this chart. But the companies that are pursuing this face many challenges and uncertainties to go after it. It doesn't mean that bringing down emissions is easily, especially toward net zero. And there are a variety of challenges and uncertainties that companies need to overcome, from transparency to technology, regulation, and cost uncertainty to the lack of uniform standards. But economics are less often the predominant challenge than people commonly assume. Solving climate change predominantly requires policy action. 20% of emissions come from hard to abate sectors. A significant part of this requires public support to be addressed. A significant share of emissions happens in areas with no or limited public scrutiny. Consumer decisions, companies that no one knows, and it's an illusion to assume that these emissions will all be eliminated without stronger government policies. And finally, too much needs to happen in too short a time. Companies can go further than they think they can go in our experience, but not far enough and fast enough on their own. The most important solutions to tackling climate change also require collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And this would also make it easier for willing actors to move. In closing, to realistically achieve net zero, governments must engage every economic sector. Carbon pricing is important and a start, but will not be sufficient. To achieve net zero, governments will need to implement strong policy in every sector of the economy, promoting things like renewable or nuclear power, helping to scale up battery vehicles and charging infrastructure, as well as the phase out of internal combustion engines, which needs to happen in the early 30s in order to achieve net zero by 2050, more building renovations and so on. So, the way I think about it, when I think about the government side, is think about 4 vectors. 1, a price on carbon. 2, incentives and support, and in some cases, subsidies for companies making the transition. 3rd, some level of protection for companies that do make transitions so that their business doesn't flow maybe to other companies or other parts of the world in companies that don't do this. And 4th, some level of regulation. In some cases, there may be some mandates, ideally not at the micro level, so companies have room to use market economics to figure out the best path to get there, but at least to set a common set of ground rules and avoiding things like assets that are not green assets, going from companies that are under scrutiny to companies that are not under scrutiny, and essentially hiding the problem. So that's what I wanted to say to get us started. Bruce, I don't know if you're leading the Q&A, but happy to talk about whatever people would be interested to discuss.
Terrific, Rich. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation and a good start here. We got some questions here in the Q&A box, so I will just pick and flow them to you. Enter, I guess, a question about emerging economies and developing countries. And from a corporate perspective, when you advise companies that are doing, have operations in developing countries, operations here in the US, how do you think about that dynamic where emerging countries haven't, they're just starting to industrialize in some cases, and the challenge of reducing emissions everywhere when you have really different economic structures in different countries?
Yeah, it is one of the very biggest issues that the world needs to wrestle with right now. I would separate it into 2 things. From a company point of view, we believe the supply chain logic is so powerful because they often have supply chain actions in many countries in the world, some of which have not gone as far to embrace this. But when the downstream customers say, this is important to us and we're ready to pay for it, and we have high expectations that we're going to, then you're pushing change all around the world across many different producers, not just changes for the companies that exist in the most developed markets. So we really believe deeply in the supply chain logic as a way to accelerate progress, not just in the most developed countries, but all around the world. But there's a second problem that we shouldn't shy away from, which is that these countries need to make changes that in many cases are not just about the producers that are supporting global companies, but in their own countries. And they have limited resources to do it. And unfortunately, COVID, they don't have the kind of debt capacity you see in the US to just add debt the way the US is. And they're going to be even more pressured coming out of this. And if we're going to have a real transition, and if we're going to have a just transition, we will need the wealthier countries of the world to do a better job of stepping up and not just creating expectations for the whole world, but providing more support to various parts of the world. That's obviously a very tricky political challenge in many countries, including here. And I think that's one we're going to have to wrestle with if we want to go at the speed we want. Increasingly, we see carbon is shifting. The most developed countries are making not the progress they need to make, to be very clear, but are making progress in more challenging parts of the world where energy is almost a basic right to try to bring people out of poverty. It is harder. It's getting easier with renewable, but it's still hard.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the great challenges we face. And even President Biden allocating, I think it was $1 billion to the Green Climate Fund. That's a drop in the bucket. And even that was politically, treacherous ground.
Exactly.
Looking at another question here from Stephen about carbon capture and storage. So our first keynote speaker, Vicky Holub, CEO of Occidental Petroleum, talked a lot about carbon capture and direct air capture this morning. Your presentation suggests that most companies can get most of their transition without going to offsets or carbon capture. What are your thoughts on carbon capture? Far too expensive today for most companies to rely on. Do you see many companies heading that way? Is Occidental Petroleum perhaps an outlier in that regard?
Well, right now they're not heading the way because right now the costs are unaffordable. But I do believe we're going to need some solutions. Now, whether direct air capture gets economic or it's more tied to production settings or in other ways where you have higher carbon dioxide concentrated feedstocks that make it lower cost to pull the carbon out. So the technologies need a ton of work, but this is, I think, going to have to be part of the solution. And in fact, even for us, so Professor Heal's comments, I felt very much like he was almost talking to me when he was presenting, because we're in a business where aviation is our most critical input provider. My scope 3 in carbon sits disproportionately in the aviation sector. So our first job, of course, is to be able to fly less, have less intensity of flying per employee. And we've announced substantial goals to reduce 30% by 2025, go further after that. I actually think we may even be able to go further before that, given all the learnings from COVID. But the truth is, part of our business will require us to be with our clients and to bring expertise, and we will not bring it to zero. So we are going to be one of the firms, because we're so dependent on a very hard to abate sector, that will need to neutralize part of our carbon. And when we made our announcement last September, I think we were the only one in our industry so far, but I hope there will be others, to actually say that by 2030, we expect to be spending around $80 a ton through a combination of nature-based solutions and engineered solutions of the kind that you're describing, to make it real. I mean, right now there's this thing called carbon neutral that people talk about being, but carbon neutral, if you look at the market, is really around $3 to $6 a ton. And it does valuable things. And we work to buy the highest quality certificates. I'm sure other firms do as well, that says real actions are happening. But the scale that we need is neutralizing, which is basically avoiding emissions elsewhere for the emissions you have, is not sufficient. We need to neutralize, put back in the ground, whether it's through regenerative agriculture practices, reforestation, or engineered solutions. We need to put back in the ground what we emit, and that is much more expensive. Those engineered solutions are well over $200 a ton now, and there's not even enough supply, even if you wanted to do it. I think the leading companies of the world, and I would, include the kind of announcement Microsoft made, others have made, we need to be helping to get early into these engineered solutions so we can get scale, we can bring them down the cost curve and make them more affordable, but they will never be cheap. It will never be cheap, which means for many companies that are in much thinner margin businesses, that's going to be a very hard part of their solution. To your point, the other point you made, I do think most companies can go further than they think, but for many, many companies, that last 20 to 40% of their carbon emissions curve, if you include their scope 3, gets into really tough and expensive stuff, which is why what Bill Gates has been talking about putting more into innovation and funding more in innovation, is just so important. So because it's not just getting 60, if we only had to get 60% of the way there to feel really good, I think we could have a lot of optimism in the world right now about, but it's 60, we need to be net zero by 2050. That's 100, not 60. And that last depends on the sector. Some it's more like 20%, some it's 40%. It's hard, and we need technology and innovation if we're going to be able to do it in an affordable way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think your point that just getting the first 60% is relatively easy, and yet we still struggle even to get there due to lack of policy support by and large. You pointed out earlier. I just want to circle back. I'm looking at time. We got a few more minutes to you talk about supply chain. And obviously, BCG is an enormous expertise with your clients on supply chain. And a question was asked by Ro about how do companies work with supply chains to remove carbon, in the sense that you mentioned earlier, Rich, that there's always an incentive for companies. If one company says I'm going to do the right thing, reduce emissions, and perhaps it's a more expensive supply chain for another company to source from less costly places and not reduce emissions. Can companies do it individually? That's really the question. Can companies do it individually, or do they need to band together? Do we need associations, trade groups? How do you address long supply chains in this problem?
Well, it is such a challenge. I talk to so many CEOs in the more upstream parts of value chains, and they're just so stressed about how to do this because their point. I was talking to one that makes iron ore. He said, if I make less carbon, if I produce iron ore in a less carbon intensive way, but then it gets blended at the steel producer. So for the standpoint of the company that's buying my iron ore, but it's already been processed through a steel mill, they just get an average cost. How will they be ready to pay more to anyone to be ready to invest? I talked to a firm that makes nitrogen, the critical fertilizer, and a really amazing stat that maybe some of your colleagues watching this know is 30% of the carbon that's in a loaf of bread you buy in a store is in the nitrogen that was used in growing the wheat to make the bread. 30% of its carbon footprint. If you made that nitrogen in a net zero way, it would add 1 penny to the loaf of bread. You say, how can we not pay a penny to get 30% of the carbon out of a loaf of bread? Okay, it's not all the way, it's not net zero, but that's a big step change for a penny. But the challenge is it's not, you've got to get farmers who live on the thinnest margins to pay more for the nitrogen. And then you've got to get the people buying the wheat from farmers to buy the net zero wheat and be ready to charge the people who produce the bread and sell it to consumers. And then they need to believe that someone will pay a penny more at the shelf, because bread is a commodity that many people rely on. And a penny doesn't sound like much, probably to most of the people watching here, but for many producing it, that might be an issue. That making that whole thing work is hard. You need to have metrics, you need to have traceability from the very upstream all the way to the downstream. You would be so much empowered if there were a price on carbon. It would make it so much easier, but we watch how hard it is for governments to do that. We need to have ideally industry associations embracing, or at least the leading companies in industry who have so much power putting pressure on the rest. We see that happening in automobiles right now, where one after another makes big announcements, and then investors start to put more pressure on the other. And ideally, we need consumers ready to pay a bit more, 2% more for things that they say they're ready to pay, but when you actually watch behavior, it often doesn't follow with what people respond to a survey that they're ready to do. So while on the one hand, the supply chain work gave me great optimism, when I talk to leaders across the value chain, you really realize just how much work is left to be done, even though the economics themselves aren't as daunting as you might have thought they would be.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. Sally asked really, I think, a really important question here, which is there a lack of technology, or is there a lack of, and her question says, imagination application, or I would say, is there a lack of commercialization of technologies? You gave the example of nitrogen and bread. But more broadly speaking, there's an argument being made today by some people that we have the solutions at hand. We have all the technologies we need. We just need better policies and better commercialization of those technologies. And others who would say, including Bill Gates and others, no, we still need a great deal of innovation, that the solutions are not there yet. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're dealing with three problems, and they're all required. Let me start with Bill's point. You absolutely need innovation, particularly for that last 30%, say 20 to 40% of the, which just so expensive, whether it's in the carbon capture question you asked me earlier, or technologies to produce basic industrial products, or manage, transportation flows. We do need more innovation. We need to fund it. We need to support it. But of course, the flip side is, well, so I can get a long way with technologies that exist today. And then you've got huge imagination is part of the issue, but a lot of it is the nuts and bolts of rebuilding big parts of supply chains and operations around the world, which is not easy. It's of scaling. I mean, the order of magnitude, I mean, people talk about growing renewables and I'm all for it, and we can do a lot. But like there's I won't get the stat exactly right. So if someone's interested, I'll get you the right stat. But in the western part of Australia, there's a huge operation being done to create renewable energy sources, to create hydrogen that could ultimately be used to power shipping with ammonia. Okay, it's a great thing. It's the size of Delaware. That's how big this site's going to be. And it would, when it works, which I'm sure it will, it's like a tiny fraction of the global shipping industry's fuel requirements. So you don't need one state of Delaware side, you need multiple states of Delaware. So then you come back to other questions. Have we underplayed the role that nuclear could play? Because that could also be the energy source to make hydrogen. But nuclear has its own challenges that I'm sure many on this call are familiar with, or other things. There's a process, technology, traceability, all the things I described earlier, but the scaling challenge ahead of us is enormous. It will not happen overnight. And that's why working to green the industries that are brown, but we need to green them to the best we can, is an important part of this on the journey to building the scale and newer technologies also.
Yeah, the scale of the Industrial Revolution of 300 years, we're compressing into about 30 years to really make that transformation.
With enormous stakes for all of us.
We don't get a redo here, right? If we don't get it right, it's there's no second chance, really. Yeah. Rich, real pleasure to have you join us here today. Thank you for the insights, and keep up the good work at BCG.
Thanks for me as well, Bruce. It's great to see you.